The heart stops, the brain flatlines. By every medical definition, the person is dead, and then they come back. They describe leaving their body, floating above the operating table, watching doctors work on the corpse below. They describe moving through a tunnel toward an overwhelming light. They describe meeting beings, sometimes deceased relatives, sometimes figures of pure radiance. They describe a life review, every moment they ever lived, experienced again, but now feeling the impact they had on others. And they describe a border, a threshold they cannot cross, a point where something, or someone, tells them it is not their time. They must return. Then they wake up in their body. The heart beats again, the brain fires, and they are never the same. This is the near-death experience, and it is far more common than you might think. Surveys suggest that approximately 4 to 5% of the general population has had one. In the United States alone, that's over 13 million people. Among those who survive cardiac arrest, clinical death followed by resuscitation, the numbers are even higher. Some studies suggest up to 20% of cardiac arrest survivors report a near-death experience. These are not fringe claims from unreliable witnesses. These are reports from airline pilots, surgeons, professors, soldiers, children too young to have cultural expectations about death. The accounts come from every culture, every religion, every century we have records for. And here is what's strange. They're remarkably consistent. Not identical, the details vary. But the core structure, the out-of-body experience, the tunnel, the light, the beings, the life review, the border, the return, appears again and again across ages and continents in people who had no prior knowledge of what others had reported. What are we to make of this? The skeptic says it's the dying brain, a final hallucination, oxygen deprivation, random neural firing, the last dream before oblivion. The experience feels profound, but it signifies nothing beyond the death throes of neurons. The believer says it's proof of the afterlife. The soul leaves the body, glimpses the world beyond, and returns with a message. Death is not the end. But perhaps both positions are too simple. Perhaps the near-death experience is neither meaningless hallucination nor literal preview of heaven. Perhaps it is something stranger, a window into the relationship between consciousness and the brain that neither materialists nor traditionalists have fully understood. Let's examine what actually happens. Let's look at the research. And let's see what these millions of accounts might be telling us about the nature of mind itself. This is consciousness cartography. The modern study of near-death experiences begins in 1975 with a psychiatrist named Raymond Moody. Moody had been collecting accounts from people who had been pronounced clinically dead and then resuscitated. He noticed that their descriptions, though varying in detail, shared a common structure. In his book, Life After Life, he coined the term near-death experience and outlined the pattern that would define the field. Not every experiencer reports every element, but the elements that appear in a consistent sequence. First, the out-of-body experience. The person perceives themselves separating from their physical body, often floating above it. They can see the room, the medical team, sometimes their own body lying below. This perspective feels absolutely real, more real, many say, than ordinary waking life. Second, the tunnel. Many describe moving through a dark space toward a distant light. Some call it a tunnel, others a void, others a passage. The movement feels rapid, purposeful, drawn toward something ahead. Third, the light. At the end of the tunnel, or simply appearing before them, is a light of extraordinary intensity. But it does not hurt to look at. Many describe it as radiating unconditional love, total acceptance, profound peace. Some identify this light as God, or as the source of all being. Others simply describe it as the light. Fourth, beings. Within or near the light, experiencers often encounter other presences. Deceased relatives are common. A grandmother who died years ago, a father lost in childhood. Some meet religious figures appropriate to their tradition. Others encounter beings they don't recognize but experience as guides or guardians. Communication happens, but rarely through speech. More often, it's direct. Thought to thought, understanding to understanding. Fifth, the life review. This is among the most reported elements. The person's entire life passes before them, but not like a film. They experience it. Every moment, every choice, every interaction. And critically, they experience it from the other person's perspective. They feel the pain they caused. They feel the love they gave. The review is not judgment from outside. It is understanding from within. Sixth, the border. At some point, the experiencer reaches a limit, a river they cannot cross, a door they cannot enter, a field with a fence, a voice that says, "Not yet, you must go back." Sometimes the choice is offered, sometimes it is commanded. But the message is clear. This journey is not complete. There is something left to do. Seventh, the return. Often sudden, often unwanted. The experiencer finds themselves back in their body, often at the moment of resuscitation. The transition is jarring. Many describe not wanting to come back. The peace of what they experienced makes ordinary life feel heavy, limited, almost unbearable at first. And eighth, the after effects. This is crucial. Near-death experiences change people. The changes are measurable, consistent, and often permanent. Raymond Moody documented these elements 50 years ago. In the decades since, researchers have tested, refined, and deepened our understanding. The pattern holds. But does the pattern prove anything? In 2001, a cardiologist named Pim van Lommel published a study in The Lancet, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. It was the first large-scale prospective study of near-death experiences in cardiac arrest patients. Prospective means they didn't just interview people who claimed to have NDEs. They systematically studied every patient who survived cardiac arrest in 10 Dutch hospitals over a period of years. 344 patients total. Within days of resuscitation, each patient was interviewed. Did they remember anything from the period when their heart had stopped? 62 patients, 18%, reported a near-death experience. The depth and content varied, but the phenomenon was real and common. Van Lommel's study addressed several critical questions. First, are NDEs caused by the duration of unconsciousness? No. There was no correlation between how long the heart had stopped and whether an NDE occurred. Some patients with brief arrests had profound experiences. Some with longer arrests remembered nothing. Second, are NDEs caused by medications? No. The patients who received medication and those who didn't reported NDEs at similar rates. Some medications actually seem to reduce the likelihood of an NDE, which is the opposite of what you'd expect if drugs caused the experience. Third, are NDEs caused by the fear of death? No. Patients who had been unconscious from the start, who had no time to be afraid, reported NDEs as often as those who might have had warning. Fourth, are NDEs caused by prior expectations? This is crucial. Patients who had never heard of NDEs reported them. Patients who expected an NDE and didn't have one were documented. Having religious beliefs, or not having them, didn't predict whether an NDE would occur. The experience seemed independent of expectation. And here's what struck Van Lommel most. During cardiac arrest, the brain shuts down. Within seconds of the heart stopping, blood pressure drops to zero. The brain's electrical activity ceases. The EEG goes flat. By every measure we have, there should be no consciousness, no experience, no memory formation. Yet patients reported vivid, coherent, detailed experiences precisely during the period when their brains showed no activity. They didn't report confused fragments or dreamlike distortions. They reported hyper-real encounters that they could describe with precision years or decades later. How does a brain with no measurable activity produce the most vivid experiences of a person's life? Van Lommel's conclusion was careful but radical. Perhaps consciousness is not produced by the brain. Perhaps the brain is more like a receiver, a transceiver that picks up consciousness rather than generating it. During cardiac arrest, the receiver breaks down, but consciousness continues. And in that state, without the filter of normal brain function, it perceives things ordinarily hidden. This is, of course, controversial. Most neuroscientists reject it. But Van Lommel's data stands. The Lancet published it. And no one has adequately explained how a flatlined brain produces crystal-clear experience. The skeptical explanations deserve serious attention. If we're going to take NDEs seriously, we need to understand what conventional science says about them. The most common explanation is oxygen deprivation. As the brain is starved of oxygen, it begins to malfunction. The visual cortex, which is sensitive to oxygen loss, might produce the tunnel effect, a narrowing of the visual field. Random firing of neurons might produce the sense of light or floating. The experience is real, but it's the brain's death rattle, not a glimpse of another realm. There are problems with this explanation. First, controlled studies of oxygen deprivation, pilots in centrifuges, high-altitude experiments, produce confused, fragmented, dreamlike states. They do not produce coherent narratives with beings, life reviews, and accurate observations of the physical environment. The phenomenology doesn't match. Second, if oxygen deprivation caused NDEs, we would expect deeper deprivation to produce more intense experiences. But Van Lommel's data showed no correlation between duration of arrest and NDE occurrence. Some of the deepest NDEs occurred with brief arrests. Some prolonged arrests produced no experience at all. Third, and most critically, many NDE accounts include accurate observations of events that occurred while the brain was not functioning. This is called veridical perception, and it's the strongest challenge to any dying brain hypothesis. Consider the case of Pam Reynolds. In 1991, she underwent a radical surgery for a brain aneurysm. Her body was cooled to 60 degrees. Her heart was stopped. Her blood was drained from her head. Her brain showed no activity. Clicks were played in her ears to monitor brainstem function. The clicks produced no response. By every measure, she was as close to dead as a person can be while still being recoverable. During this period, Pam Reynolds had a near-death experience. She reported floating out of her body and watching the surgery from above. She accurately described the unusual bone saw used to open her skull, a tool she had never seen before and couldn't have known about. She accurately described conversations that occurred between surgical staff while she was clinically dead. How did she perceive these things with a brain showing no activity? Another explanation offered is DMT, dimethyltryptamine, the powerful psychedelic compound. Some researchers have suggested that the dying brain releases DMT, producing the NDE. This is intriguing. DMT experiences do share some features with NDEs, encounters with beings, feelings of profound meaning, perception of other realms. But there are problems here too. First, no study has demonstrated that the human brain actually releases significant DMT at death. The hypothesis remains speculative. Second, DMT experiences, while sometimes featuring beings and other worlds, have a different quality. They're often described as alien, bizarre, overwhelming in their strangeness. NDEs are typically described as familiar, like coming home, like remembering something forgotten. The emotional signature is different. A third explanation is REM intrusion, the dreaming state intruding into waking consciousness. Some researchers have found that people who report NDEs are more likely to have experienced REM intrusion at other times in their lives. Perhaps the NDE is a kind of waking dream, but this doesn't explain the veridical perceptions. Dreams don't accurately report conversations happening in the room next door, and it doesn't explain why the phenomenology is so consistent across cultures and individuals. Our dreams are wildly varied. NDEs are remarkably similar. None of the skeptical explanations are satisfying on their own. They might contribute. Oxygen plays a role. Neurotransmitters play a role. The brain's response to crisis plays a role. But they don't explain the coherence, the consistency, and above all, the accurate perceptions during periods of no brain function. Something else is happening. Perhaps the most striking feature of near-death experiences is how consistent they are across cultures. A Tibetan Buddhist who dies in the Himalayas, a Christian grandmother who dies in Missouri, a secular atheist who dies in a Tokyo hospital, a child in India who has never heard of any of these traditions. They report the same basic structure: out of body, movement toward light, beings, life review, border, return. The details vary. The Christian might see Jesus. The Hindu might see Yamaraj, the Lord of Death. The atheist might see no religious figures at all, just beings of light without specific identity. But the structure, the architecture of the experience, is consistent. And this consistency reaches back through time. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, written in the 8th century, describes the experiences of consciousness between death and rebirth. The dying person encounters brilliant lights of various colors. They meet peaceful and wrathful deities. They face a life review called the Judgment. They eventually move toward rebirth, unless they recognize the lights as projections of their own mind and achieve liberation. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, far older, describes the soul's journey after death. The deceased travels through the underworld, encountering various beings and obstacles. They face the weighing of the heart, a judgment scene where their deeds are measured. They seek to reach the field of reeds, the blessed afterlife. The Gnostics, as we've explored in a previous video, describe the soul ascending through the spheres of the archons after death, confronting each one with knowledge, seeking to return to the pleroma, the realm of light from which it came. Even Plato, in the Republic, tells the myth of Er, a soldier who died in battle, traveled to another realm, witnessed souls being judged and choosing new lives, and then returned to his body on the funeral pyre. These traditions differ in their specifics, their theologies, their cosmologies, but they share the same essential map. Consciousness continues. It leaves the body. It encounters light, beings, judgment. It faces a border between this world and another. Modern NDE researchers did not know these ancient texts when they began their work. Raymond Moody was a psychiatrist collecting stories from cardiac patients, not an antiquarian studying Tibetan Buddhism. Yet the pattern he documented mirrors what humans have reported for millennia. What are we to make of this? One possibility: these are cultural artifacts. Humans fear death, and so we've developed comforting stories that persist across generations. Modern experiencers unconsciously draw on these cultural templates when interpreting their dying brains. But this doesn't quite work. The consistency is too precise. Cultural beliefs about death vary wildly. Reincarnation, heaven, hell, annihilation, ancestor realms, various hells and heavens with specific geographies. If NDS simply reflected cultural expectation, we would see far more variation. The Christian would experience Christian imagery throughout. The Buddhist would experience Buddhist imagery throughout, but they don't. They experience the same core structure, decorated with cultural details. Another possibility: the ancient maps are accurate. Consciousness actually does leave the body at death. It actually does encounter light, beings, judgment, and a border. The ancients knew this because some of them came back to report it, just like modern NDERAs. The consistency exists because the territory is real. This is a staggering claim. It implies that consciousness is not produced by the brain, that it survives bodily death, that there is genuinely another realm, or dimension, or state of being, that humans have always been able to glimpse at the threshold of death. We cannot prove this, but we cannot dismiss it either. The evidence is substantial, the consistency is remarkable, and the implications are profound. There is a specific category of near-death experience that poses the sharpest challenge to any brain-based explanation. People who have been blind from birth sometimes report near-death experiences, and in these experiences, they see. Kenneth Ring, a psychologist at the University of Connecticut, spent years studying this phenomenon. He documented case after case of congenitally blind individuals who, during cardiac arrest or other near-death states, suddenly had visual perception. They saw the medical equipment in the operating room. They saw the doctors and nurses, could describe their clothing, their actions. They saw their own bodies lying on the table. Bodies they had never seen before, only felt. One woman, blind from birth, described the pattern of the tiles on the ceiling above the operating table. Another described the colors of objects in the room, colors she had never experienced in her entire life, since she had never had functional vision. How does a brain that has never processed visual information suddenly produce accurate visual perception during cardiac arrest? The visual cortex of someone blind from birth is not wired for sight. It has been repurposed for other functions. The neural architecture for vision simply doesn't exist in the normal way. Yet they saw, and what they saw was accurate. This is veridical perception in its most extreme form. It's not just that the experiences feel real. It's that they contain information that could not have been obtained through any normal sensory channel, especially not by someone who has no functional visual system. The blind seeing, accurate observations of events miles away. knowledge of conversations in other rooms, recognition of deceased relatives the experiencer had never met in life, later confirmed by photographs. These cases don't prove that consciousness survives death, but they strongly suggest that consciousness, during these experiences, is not limited to the brain. It is accessing information in ways that our current neuroscience cannot explain. Bruce Grayson, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, has spent decades collecting such cases. He developed the Grayson NDE scale, a standardized measure to quantify the depth and features of near-death experiences. His database now contains thousands of accounts, many with verified details. And his conclusion, like Van Lommel's, is carefully stated but revolutionary. The evidence suggests that consciousness is not entirely dependent on brain function. During NDEs, it seems to operate independently, and in some ways more clearly than when filtered through the brain. The AWARE study, conducted by Sam Parnia at multiple hospitals, attempted to test this directly. They placed hidden images on shelves high in emergency rooms, visible only from above. If patients actually floated out of their bodies during cardiac arrest, they should be able to see these images and report them. The results were inconclusive. Of the small number of patients who reported out-of-body experiences, none could describe the hidden images, but several could describe other verifiable details from the room. The study neither proved nor disproved the phenomenon. It showed how difficult it is to study something that occurs unpredictably in chaotic medical environments to patients fighting for their lives. The research continues, but what we have is already enough to challenge the assumption that consciousness is merely what brains do. Perhaps the most important data about near-death experiences comes not from what happens during them, but from what happens after. NDEs change people. The changes are consistent, dramatic, and often permanent. The most common after effect is the loss of the fear of death. This is nearly universal among NDErs. They no longer fear dying, not because they're suicidal. Most become more committed to living fully, but because they now know, not believe but know, that death is not the end. The fear simply dissolves. Many become more compassionate, more empathetic, more concerned with others. The life review seems to be key here. Having felt the impact of their actions on others, having experienced their own cruelty and kindness from the receiving end, they return with a different orientation. Relationships matter more. Material success matters less. Career changes are common. High-powered executives quit to become hospice workers, nurses, teachers. The priorities shift. What seemed important before, wealth, status, achievement, pales against the experience of unconditional love they encountered. Religious beliefs often change, though not always in predictable ways. Some become more religious. Others become less religious, but more spiritual. Many report that organized religion now seems too narrow, too dogmatic. They experienced something that transcended all doctrines. They struggle to fit it back into the boxes. Relationships are complicated by NDEs. Marriages sometimes fail because the experiencer has changed so profoundly that they no longer fit their old life. But new, deeper connections often form with those who understand, and there are stranger after effects. Many NDErs report increased psychic phenomena, intuitions that prove accurate, knowing when someone is about to call, sensing the deaths of distant loved ones at the moment they occur. Some report difficulty with electronic devices, watches that stop working, computers that malfunction in their presence. These claims are harder to verify, but they appear so consistently that researchers have documented them systematically. Something seems to shift in the person's relationship to ordinary reality. What does this suggest? Psychological explanations say the NDE is a profound experience that shifts the person's worldview, like any major life event. True enough. But why do the shifts take this particular form? Why does almost everyone lose fear of death, become more compassionate, become less materialistic? If these were random hallucinations, wouldn't the after effects be more variable? Skeptics might say survivors of any brush with death become more grateful for life. But NDErs are different from other cardiac arrest survivors. Those who had no experience during their arrest don't show the same pattern of transformation. The experience itself, not the close call, seems to be what changes people. And here's the deepest implication. If the NDE is merely a hallucination of the dying brain, why does it produce such consistent positive transformation? Why does a meaningless neural misfire lead to lasting increases in compassion, meaning, and psychological well-being? Maybe the experience is not meaningless. Maybe it touches something real, and maybe that contact with something real, whatever it is what transforms people. So what are near-death experiences actually telling us? We don't know. Any honest assessment must begin there. We do not know what these experiences are. We do not know whether they represent genuine perception of an afterlife or an elaborate production of a dying brain, or something else entirely that our current frameworks cannot accommodate. But we can say what the evidence suggests. It suggests that consciousness during cardiac arrest is not always absent. Millions of people have reported vivid experiences during periods when their brains showed no measurable activity. Either they are all lying or mistaken, or consciousness can persist in some form without normal brain function. It suggests that consciousness in this state can sometimes perceive things accurately. The veridical perceptions, the blind seeing, the observations of events in other rooms, the accurate descriptions of medical procedures, are difficult to explain if the experience is purely internal. It suggests that the experience has a consistent structure across cultures and throughout history. The map of death that Raymond Moody described in 1975 matches the maps that Egyptian priests, Tibetan lamas, and Greek philosophers drew thousands of years ago. Either humanity has been hallucinating the same hallucination for millennia, or we've been glimpsing the same territory. And it suggests that the experience has real effects. People who have NDEs are changed in consistent ways. They lose their fear of death. They become more compassionate. They report that life has more meaning, even as they become less attached to material success. What framework can hold all this? Perhaps consciousness is not produced by the brain. Perhaps, as Aldous Huxley suggested, the brain is more like a reducing valve. It filters and limits consciousness rather than creating it. In ordinary life, this filter gives us a manageable slice of reality, focused on survival. In death, or near death, the filter breaks down, and consciousness expands into something larger. This would explain why NDEs feel more real than ordinary life, not less. If normal waking consciousness is a reduced state and the NDE is what happens when the reduction lifts, then of course it would feel like awakening from a dream rather than entering one. This would explain the consistency. If NDERs are perceiving an actual realm or an actual state of being, then we would expect their reports to match, just as reports of explorers match when they describe the same landscape. And this would explain the transformation. If people genuinely encounter unconditional love, if they genuinely experience their interconnection with all beings, if they genuinely see that death is not the end, then of course they would return changed. They would have experienced something true. We cannot prove this. Science, as currently practiced, is not equipped to study consciousness directly. It can study brains, behaviors, reports. But the actual experience, the felt quality of awareness, remains beyond its reach. But absence of proof is not proof of absence, and the evidence we do have points towards something extraordinary. Millions of people across all cultures, throughout all of recorded history, have reported that at the moment of death, consciousness does not end. It expands. It encounters light and beings. It reviews its life with perfect clarity, and it approaches a border beyond which lies something. We don't know what lies beyond the border. The experiencers were sent back. They couldn't cross, but they returned with a message that is remarkably consistent. Don't be afraid. This is not the end. What you are is more than you know. If you want to continue exploring the maps of consciousness that humans have drawn for millennia, subscribe to Consciousness Cartography. Next, we'll explore the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the ancient Buddhist manual for navigating the realms between death and rebirth. The Tibetans spent centuries studying what happens after the heart stops. Their map is extraordinarily detailed, and it matches what modern NDERs report in ways that should not be possible. The territory continues to reveal itself. I'll see you in the next video.